Miss Marple and the Mysterious Death on Market Day. Welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey. Are you counting the days to the winter holidays, New Year and Christmas? Or do you prefer the easy warmth of summertime? Tell us below, and don't forget to subscribe so our cozy community can keep growing. Now let's begin tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Stalls. Bunting and a first-taste market basing on a Saturday morning in early autumn was, Miss Marple reflected as she made her way down the high street, exactly what a market town ought to be. The bunting strung between the lampposts fluttered gently in the mild breeze. The church clock tower rose solid and reassuring above the slate rooftops, and the cobbled square was alive with the cheerful commerce of country people who knew their business and did it well. Miss Marple paused at the corner, adjusting the basket on her arm. She had promised her nephew Raymond a pot of the local honey, and there was no better place to find it than here, where Mrs. Meadow set up her stall every Saturday beneath the oak that had stood in the square since Cromwell's time. The market was in full voice. Stallholders called their wares with practiced lungs. A woman in a brown coat haggled over the price of Brussels sprouts. 2 children darted between the stalls, pursued by a harried mother. The smell of fresh bread mingled with the earthier scents of vegetables still bearing traces of the soil, and somewhere a cage of rabbits thumped and rustled. It was all perfectly ordinary, perfectly English, and perfectly harmless. Or so it seemed. Miss Marple's keen blue eyes, however, had already noted several things that were not quite as they should be. The young man at the apple stall, for instance, stood with his shoulders tense and his jaw set as though he were expecting trouble. The neat woman at the lace barrow kept glancing toward the church clock with an expression that suggested she was counting minutes rather than customers. And the portly gentleman who had just emerged from the post office, twirling what appeared to be a small silver spoon as though it were a conductor's baton, wore the sort of satisfied smile that generally meant someone else was going to be made unhappy very shortly. "Morning, Miss Marple," called a familiar voice. Miss Marple turned to see Lady Bantry bearing down upon her, resplendent in a tweed suit that had probably been expensive 30 years ago and was now merely comfortable. "Dolly, how nice," said Miss Marple warmly. "I didn't expect to see you at the market today." "Oh, I simply had to come," Lady Bantry replied, linking her arm through Miss Marple's with the easy affection of long friendship. "Mrs. Bully has the most marvelous King Pippins this year. Absolutely enormous in such a color. I want to secure a bushel before they're all gone." Mrs. Bully is the widow with the apple stall. That's right. Poor woman. Lost her husband 3 years ago. Keeps the orchard going all by herself with just her son to help. Jack came back from national service in the spring. Handsome as paint, but with rather too much of his father's temper, I'm afraid. They moved together through the crowd. Miss Marple observed the scene with the gentle attention that was characteristic of her. She had spent many decades in St. Mary Mead, and human nature in that small village had taught her a great deal. Market basing was larger, certainly, but the patterns remained the same. There were always the hard workers and the idle ones, the honest and the dishonest, the kind and the cruel. The portly gentleman with the silver spoon had stopped at the lace barrow. Miss Marple could hear his voice, loud and unpleasant. "Rent's due Tuesday, Mrs. Crick. I trust you'll have it ready. I shouldn't like to have to take steps." The neat woman behind the barrow, a person of perhaps 40, with careful hands and a careful face, murmured something inaudible. "Who is that gentleman?" Miss Marple inquired. Lady Bantry's mouth tightened. "That's Aubrey Cole, market reeve, moneylender, and general pest. He collects fees for the stalls, but somehow the fees always seem to be rather higher than anyone else remembers agreeing to. Lends money, too, at rates that would make a bank blush. Half the stall holders owe him something." "I see," said Miss Marple quietly. They had reached the apple stall. It was indeed impressive. Great wooden crates were stacked behind a long trestle table, and on the table itself was a pyramidal display of apples, so perfect they might have been waxed for a photograph. Each one was a deep gold streaked with russet, and they gleamed in the autumn sunshine like treasure. Behind the stall stood a woman of perhaps 50, broad-shouldered and capable-looking, with iron gray hair tucked severely beneath a white kerchief. Her apron was spotless, and her hands, as she arranged her wares, moved with the confidence of someone who had been handling fruit all her life. This clearly was Mrs. Nell Bully. Beside her, though not helping very much, stood a young man of about 25. He had the sort of good looks that turn heads, but there was something unsettled about him, like a dog that has learned to expect a kick. "Mrs. Bully," Lady Bantry called out cheerfully. "I've come for my pippins." Mrs. Bully looked up, and her stern face softened slightly. "Morning, Lady Bantry. I've put aside a good bushel for you. Prime specimens. Marvelous. Oh, this is my friend Miss Marple from St. Mary Mead." "Ma'am," said Mrs. Bully with a nod. Miss Marple smiled. "What beautiful apples. I don't think I've ever seen finer." "King Pippins," Mrs. Bully said, and there was unmistakable pride in her voice. "My late husband planted those trees 20 years back. This is the best crop we've had. She's offering tastings," Lady Bantry said. "Uses that clever little tool to get a slice right from the center. Very hygienic." Mrs. Bully indicated a steel instrument that lay on the chopping block beside the apples. It looked rather like a large apple corer, but with a mechanism for ejecting the core. Miss Marple had seen such things before, apple testers as they were called. The better greengrocers used them to show customers that the fruit was sound all the way through. "Take a sliver at noon," Mrs. Bully said. "I always start the tasting then, it's tradition." The church clock showed 5 minutes to 12. Other people were gathering around the stall now, drawn by the magnificent display. Miss Marple noticed the haberdasher, Mrs. Crick, standing a little apart with her careful face. She noticed a slow-moving man in a porter's apron watching from beside the scales. She noticed a shopkeeper in sleeve garters, probably the chemist from across the square, examining the crates with a professional eye, and then she noticed Aubrey Cole. He came striding through the crowd as though he owned it, which perhaps in a sense he did. The silver snuff spoon was still in his hand, and he flourished it like a baton as he walked. People stepped aside for him, not with respect, but with the weary attention one gives to something unpleasant that cannot be avoided. "Mrs. Bully," he called out in a voice that carried across the square. "I hear your pippins are the talk of the county." Mrs. Bully's face went very still. "Mr. Cole, I shall have to judge for myself." "Naturally." He had reached the stall now and stood there rocking slightly on his heels, the picture of a man pleased with his own importance. "Can't have the market reeve showing favoritism, eh? Must sample the tasting begins at noon," Mrs. Bully said tightly. Cole pulled out a pocket watch and made a show of consulting it. 4 minutes. I can wait." He tucked the watch away and smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Of course, there's the small matter of your stall fees, Mrs. Bully. You're a week behind. I'm aware of it. Just so we understand each other. I shouldn't like anything to spoil your fine display here." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Lady Bantry made an indignant noise, but Mrs. Bully simply pressed her lips together and said nothing. Her son Jack, however, had gone very red in the face. "Leave her alone, Cole," he said in a low voice. Cole turned to him with that same unpleasant smile. "National service teach you manners, did it, young Bully?" "Doesn't sound like it." "Jack," said Mrs. Bully sharply, "mind the stall." Jack opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it again. He picked up one of the crates and carried it away toward the waystand, his back rigid with suppressed fury. The church clock began to strike 12. The deep notes rolled across the square, and the market seemed to pause as markets do at the turning of the hour. Mrs. Bolly reached out and selected an apple from the display. She set it on the chopping block with a solid thump. Then she picked up the tester, that clever steel tool, and positioned it carefully at the apple's center. "Your first taste, Mr. Cole," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady. Cole stepped forward, still smiling, still twirling his little silver spoon. Miss Marple, standing quietly beside Lady Bantry, felt an odd little prickle at the back of her neck, the sort of feeling she had learned never to ignore. She watched as Mrs. Belly twisted the tester, driving it down through the apple with practiced ease. She watched as the woman pulled the tool free, bringing with it a neat cylindrical core. She watched as Mrs. Belly pressed the ejector pin and pushed out a single perfect sliver of apple into a small paper cone, and she watched as Mrs. Belly held out the cone to Aubrey Cole. "Bless the King, Pippins," Cole said with a mocking little bow. He took the sliver, raised it to his mouth, and bit down. For just a moment, nothing happened. Cole chewed, his expression suggesting he was preparing some further piece of mockery. The crowd watched. The 12th stroke of the clock faded into silence. Then Cole's face changed. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of confusion. Then his hand went to his throat. His mouth opened, and a harsh, scraping cough tore out of him. Once, twice, terrible sounds that made people step back. The silver spoon fell from his fingers and clattered on the cobblestones. He tried to speak, but only a choking rasp emerged. His face had gone gray-white except for an odd flush high on his cheeks. His eyes were wide and frightened, all the mockery gone, replaced by an animal terror. "Cole?" someone said uncertainly. Aubrey Cole swayed, reached out blindly for support that wasn't there, and collapsed like a puppet with cut strings. He fell hard on the cobbles and lay still, his body jerking once, twice, and then not at all. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Lady Bantry said in a voice that shook only slightly, "Someone fetch Dr. Haydock," and Miss Marple very quietly took a single step closer to the apple stall, her keen old eyes already taking in details that others might miss. The morning's perfect ordinariness had shattered like dropped china, and beneath it lay something very dark indeed. Chapter 2. A slice, a cough, and a fall. The silence that followed Aubrey Cole's collapse lasted perhaps 3 seconds, though it felt much longer. Then the market erupted into noise. Women screamed. Men shouted. Someone knocked over a basket of turnips in their haste to get closer, or perhaps to get away. The slow porter from the waystand came lumbering across the cobbles with surprising speed. Lady Bantry clutched Miss Marple's arm so tightly it would leave a bruise. "Is he dead?" someone cried out. "Give him air! Fetch the doctor!" A boy of perhaps 12 went pelting toward the high street, his boots striking sparks from the cobblestones. Mrs. Bully stood frozen behind her stall, the apple tester still in her hand, her face drained of all color. Her son Jack had pushed back through the crowd and now stood staring down at Cole's motionless form with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read. Horror, certainly, but something else as well. Relief, perhaps, or calculation. Miss Marple herself remained very still. She had lived long enough to know that moments like these revealed a great deal about people if one only watched carefully. Already the crowd was forming itself into patterns. Those who rushed forward to help. Those who hung back uncertain. Those who looked guilty though they had no reason to. Those who looked frightened when perhaps they should have looked sorrowful. The haberdasher, Mrs. Crick, had gone paper white. She stood beside her lace barrow with one hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the fallen man. The chemist in the sleeve garters had frozen halfway across the square, his ruddy face suddenly pale. Even the rabbits in their cage had gone silent, as though sensing that something dreadful had occurred. A man in a brown suit pushed through the onlookers and knelt beside Cole. He was perhaps 60, with a brisk professional manner that spoke of long practice. He felt for a pulse at Cole's neck, then at his wrist. He pulled back one of Cole's eyelids, then let it fall. His mouth tightened. "Dr. Haydock," Lady Bantry whispered to Miss Marple. Thank goodness he was here. Dr. Haydock looked up at the circle of faces surrounding him. "Stand back, please." "Give the man space. Is he—" Mrs. Bully's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Dr. Haydock rose to his feet, brushing dust from his knees. His face was grave. "I'm very sorry. There's nothing to be done. He's gone." A fresh wave of exclamations rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Bully swayed slightly, and her son moved to support her. The haberdasher gave a small choked sound and turned away, pressing her handkerchief to her face. "But how?" Lady Bantry demanded. "He was perfectly well not 2 minutes ago." "Violent respiratory failure," Dr. Haydock said slowly. "Very swift. I've seen this sort of thing before, though not often. The heart, most likely, or possibly a severe allergic reaction, though that seems less probable given the speed. He just ate a piece of apple from Mrs. Bully's stall." All eyes turned to the apple display. The magnificent King Pippins gleamed as beautifully as before, innocent and golden. The apple from which the slice had been taken still sat on the chopping block, the neat cylindrical hole at its center showing pale flesh that was already beginning to oxidize to brown. "The heat, perhaps," Dr. Haydock murmured, more to himself than to the crowd, "or the excitement. Cole always did put too much strain on his constitution. Ate too richly, drank too deeply. These things catch up with a man," but his tone lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noticed that his eyes kept returning to Cole's face. There was something about that face that troubled him, something that did not quite fit the diagnosis he was offering. Inspector Slack arrived at that moment, puffing slightly from his rapid walk from the police station. He was a solid man with a bulldog face and a manner that suggested he had solved every crime before it was even committed. Miss Marple had encountered him before during that unfortunate business at the vicarage in St. Mary Mead, and she knew him for a man who preferred simple explanations to complicated ones. "What's all this, then?" Slack demanded, surveying the scene with evident displeasure. "Dr. Haydock, what's happened?" "Aubrey Cole has died very suddenly, collapsed right here in the market square." Slack looked down at the body with the expression of a man who's been personally inconvenienced. "Natural causes, I suppose." "Almost certainly," Dr. Haydock agreed, but again, there was that note of uncertainty. Slack turned his attention to the apple stall. "This the stall he was at?" Mrs. Bully nodded, still unable to speak. "He ate something, a slice of apple," Jack Bully said. His voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Just a tasting. My mother offers them every Saturday. There's nothing wrong with the apples." "I'm not suggesting there is, lad." Slack picked up the apple from the chopping block and examined it with a frown. He sniffed it cautiously, then set it down again. "Looks perfectly ordinary. Smells right, too." He turned to Dr. Haydock. "You say it was his heart?" "That would be my initial assessment, though, of course, a proper examination will be necessary." Of course, of course." Heat of the day, excitement of the market, man of his build and habits. "Yes, that would make sense." Miss Marple, who had been standing so quietly that most people had forgotten she was there, now took a small step forward. The movement was slight, but it brought her within reach of the apple stall. She leaned down, ostensibly to steady herself against the edge of the trestle table, and as she did so, she breathed in deeply. Apples. Certainly, the clean, sweet smell of good fruit, the faint tang of wood from the crates, the sharper note of Mrs. Bully's vinegar-cleaned apron, and underneath it all, so faint that she almost missed it, something else. Something that made her pause and breathe in again, more carefully this time. Bitter almond. It was just a trace, a ghost of a scent that was there one moment and gone the next. But Miss Marple had smelled it before, many years ago, when her maid's gentleman friend had worked at a photography studio and brought home bottles of chemicals wrapped in brown paper. She had thought it a queer, unpleasant smell then, and she thought so now. Bitter almond, where there should be only apple. Miss Marple? Lady Bantry was looking at her with concern. Are you quite well? You've gone rather pale. Quite well, thank you, Dolly, Miss Marple said gently. Just a little shaken by the excitement, that's all. She straightened up and let her gaze travel across the stall. The steel tester lay where Mrs. Bully had set it down, its barrel gleaming in the sunlight. Beside it, the little paper cone that had held Cole's fatal slice. The vinegar rag that Mrs. Bully had used earlier to wipe down the table. Everything was neat. Everything was orderly. Too orderly, perhaps. Miss Marple's eyes, shrewd despite their watery blue innocence, noted several small things. The way Mrs. Bully's knife, which should have been sticky with apple juice after a morning's work, lay clean and dry. The way the tester itself seemed to have been wiped with particular care, as though someone had been anxious to remove every trace of use. The way Mrs. Crick, the haberdasher, was standing just a little too far back, as though she did not want to be associated with the stall. And on the cobblestones, half hidden by the edge of the crowd, lay Aubrey Cole's silver snuff spoon. Miss Marple could just see it from where she stood. The handle gleamed bright in the autumn sun, but the bowl had gone dark, tarnished in a way that silver should not tarnish in the space of mere minutes. Unless, of course, it had touched something that silver should never touch. Inspector Slack was questioning Mrs. Bully now, his tone blunt but not unkind. You prepared this tasting slice yourself? Yes, using that tool there. Yes, the apple tester. I've used it all morning. And there was nothing unusual about the apple? Nothing that made you think twice? Nothing. It was perfect. They're all perfect. Mrs. Bully's voice cracked slightly. I would never serve anything that wasn't sound. Never. No one's saying you did, Mrs. Bully, Dr. Haydock put in quietly. This was clearly a medical event. Cole's heart simply gave out. But Miss Marple noticed that the doctor was looking at Cole's face again, at the peculiar ashy gray color of it, and at the faint bluish tinge around the lips. She noticed, too, that he seemed troubled by something he could not quite identify. The crowd was beginning to disperse now, driven away by Inspector Slack's efficient clearing of the scene. The body would be removed, the market would continue, and by evening the whole thing would have been reduced to gossip and speculation. The porter was already bringing a sheet from somewhere. 2 constables had appeared to help with the unpleasant task of moving Cole's remains. Lady Bantry drew Miss Marple away from the stall. How dreadful, she murmured. Poor man. Though between you and me, Jane, I can't say I'm entirely sorry. He was a nasty piece of work, was he indeed? Miss Marple said softly. Oh yes, bled people dry with his lending and enjoyed doing it. Half the town will sleep easier tonight, I shouldn't wonder. Miss Marple nodded slowly. She glanced back at the apple stall one more time. Mrs. Bully was standing with her head bowed, her son's arm around her shoulders. The magnificent display of King Pippins gleamed on, beautiful and treacherous, and Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that appearances were the most deceptive things in the world, knew with absolute certainty that Aubrey Cole had not died of his heart. He had been murdered. The only question was, how, and by whom? And those, Miss Marple thought as she let Lady Bantry lead her away toward the honey store, were questions that would require a great deal of careful thought and a great deal of careful observation. Fortunately, careful observation was something at which Miss Marple had become rather expert over the years. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Bitter Almond. The honey store proved an excellent vantage point. Mrs. Meadow, a comfortable woman with beeswax under her fingernails and a talent for minding her own business, accepted Miss Marple's shilling for a pot of comb honey and then tactfully busied herself with rearranging her stock. This left Miss Marple and Lady Bantry standing beneath the oak tree with a clear view across the square to where the constables were performing their melancholy duty. "I still can't quite believe it," Lady Bantry said, watching as they lifted the sheeted form onto a stretcher. One moment he was standing there, large as life and twice as unpleasant, and the next— "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Slack had taken up a position beside the apple stall, his notebook out, his pencil moving in short, decisive strokes. Dr. Haydock stood nearby, speaking to him in low tones. Mrs. Blee had sunk onto an upturned crate, her capable hands hanging loose in her lap. Jack had disappeared somewhere into the market, perhaps unable to bear the stares and whispers that followed such an event. Miss Marple watched it all with eyes that missed very little. She had already made several mental notes, and now she was making several more. "Dolly," she said quietly, "would you mind terribly if we went back to the stall for just a moment? I believe I dropped my handkerchief near there." Lady Bantry looked startled. "Did you?" "I didn't notice." "I'm almost certain I did," Miss Marple said with gentle firmness, and Lady Bantry, who knew that tone, asked no further questions. They made their way back across the square. The crowd had thinned considerably. People who had been drawn by morbid curiosity were now being drawn away by the ordinary demands of their Saturday shopping. The rabbits had resumed their thumping. A woman was haggling again over Brussels sprouts, though in somewhat more subdued tones than before. Inspector Slack looked up as they approached. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, I'm afraid this area is still under investigation." "Of course, Inspector," Miss Marple said apologetically. "I only thought I might have dropped my handkerchief somewhere near the stall." "I do hope I'm not being a bother." Slack's expression suggested that she was, but he could hardly refuse such a reasonable request. "Very well, but please be quick about it." Miss Marple moved slowly along the edge of the stall, her eyes apparently searching the ground. In fact, she was studying the stall itself with intense concentration. She bent down, ostensibly to peer under the trestle table, and as she did so, she drew as close as she dared to the chopping block where the fatal apple still sat. The scent was still there, fainter now, almost gone, but still perceptible if one knew what one was seeking. That queer, bitter note that should not be present anywhere near fresh fruit. Miss Marple had encountered it only a few times in her long life, but it was not a smell one forgot easily. She moved her attention to the apple tester. It lay on the block, innocent-looking, just a tool like any other. But when Miss Marple leaned very close to it, bringing her face near enough that Lady Bantry made a small noise of concern, she caught that same bitter trace. It clung to the steel barrel like a ghost, barely there, but unmistakable to someone who knew what she was seeking. "Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock had noticed her peculiar behavior. "Are you quite all right?" Miss Marple straightened up with the careful movements of someone whose joints were not as reliable as they once had been. "Perfectly all right, thank you, doctor, though I confess the smell is rather strong here." "The smell of the apples, of course," Miss Marple said innocently, "and the vinegar Mrs. Bawley uses for cleaning. It's quite pungent, isn't it?" "I suppose so," Dr. Haydock said, though he looked puzzled. Lady Bantry, however, had caught something in Miss Marple's tone. She wrinkled her nose and sniffed experimentally. "It does smell of vinegar, and something else." "Something sharp, like soap, perhaps." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. She glanced down at the cobblestones near where Cole had fallen. "Oh dear, I'm afraid my handkerchief isn't here after all. How foolish of me." As she spoke, her gaze had fixed on something that lay half hidden by a cabbage leaf someone had dropped. It was Cole's silver snuff spoon, the one he had been flourishing so proudly before his death. Miss Marple bent and picked it up, brushing away the cabbage leaf with fingers that trembled only slightly. The handle was bright and clean, but the bowl had gone black, as though it had been held in a flame or dipped in some corrosive substance. The tarnish was uneven, concentrated at the deepest part of the bowl where powder or snuff would have rested. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly. "I believe this is Mr. Cole's." Slack took it from her, examined it briefly, and tucked it into his pocket with a grunt. "His snuff spoon? Yes, I saw him with it earlier. Vain fool, always showing off." "The bowl seems quite tarnished," Miss Marple observed. "Silver does that," Slack said dismissively. "Especially cheap silver. Cole probably bought it off a market stall somewhere. Thought it made him look distinguished." But Dr. Haydock had taken the spoon back from Slack and was examining it with greater attention. His frown deepened. "This tarnishing is very rapid, Slack. Silver doesn't normally blacken like this in a matter of minutes." "Probably been in his pocket all morning," Slack replied. "Sweat and polish and whatnot. It'd all react badly with metal." "Possibly," Dr. Haydock said, but he did not sound convinced. Miss Marple said nothing more. She had learned long ago that there were times to speak and times to remain silent. This was decidedly a time for silence. She had seen what she needed to see, smelled what she needed to smell. The bitter almond on the tester and the block, the blackened silver, the too clean knife, and the vinegar rag. These were not the signs of a natural death. Lady Bantry drew her away from the stall. "Jane," she said in a low voice, "you've got that look." "What look, dear?" "The look you had when the vicar's wife was found dead in the study. The look that means you've noticed something nobody else has." Miss Marple patted her friend's arm gently. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Dolly. I'm just a foolish old woman who's lost her handkerchief." "You never had a handkerchief to lose," Lady Bantry said flatly. "You wanted another look at that stall. Why?" They had moved beyond the range of Inspector Slack's hearing. Now, Miss Marple glanced back at the apple display, at the steel tester gleaming in the autumn light, at Mrs. Blully sitting with her head bowed. "Dolly," she said very quietly, "when you were close to the stall, did you smell anything unusual, apart from the apples and the vinegar?" Lady Bantry considered. "I'm not sure." "Something sharp, as I said." "Rather unpleasant. Why?" "Bitter almond," Miss Marple said. "Just a trace of it on the block on the tester. And that scent, my dear, should not be anywhere near a fruit stall." Lady Bantry's eyes widened. "But bitter almond means—" "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I rather think it does." They stood in silence for a moment. Around them, the market continued its business, heedless and ordinary. A child laughed. A dog barked. Someone dropped a coin, and it rang against the cobblestones like a small bell. And in the midst of all that ordinary life, Miss Marple knew with cold certainty that she had just encountered something extraordinary. Murder, most deliberate, and most clever. The question now was not whether Aubrey Cole had been killed, but how the thing had been accomplished, and by whom, and for what reason. These were puzzles that would require careful unraveling, the sort of work that Miss Marple had done before in her quiet way. "We must say nothing yet," she told Lady Bantry firmly. "Inspector Slack is convinced it was a natural death, and Dr. Haydock is not certain. Until I have more evidence, it would be most unwise to make accusations. But Jane, if someone murdered him, then that someone believes they have gotten away with it." Miss Marple said, "And a person who believes they have gotten away with murder is much more likely to make a mistake than one who knows they are suspected." Lady Bantry nodded slowly. You want them to feel safe, precisely. And in the meantime, I shall observe. She glanced back once more at the apple stall, at the magnificent King Pippins gleaming like golden promises, and at the steel tester lying so innocently on the block. Bitter almond, where there should be only sweetness. Yes, Miss Marple thought, most definitely murder. Chapter 6. The Tester with a Rust Bloom. It was nearly an hour later when Miss Marple found herself back at the apple stall, this time with a perfectly legitimate reason for being there. Lady Bantry had insisted on purchasing her bushel of King Pippins, and Mrs. Bully, though still shaken, had rallied sufficiently to attend to business. The market had returned to something approaching normality, though voices remained hushed, and people still cast sidelong glances at the spot where Aubrey Cole had fallen. Inspector Slack had departed, taking with him his notebook and his certainty that nothing criminal had occurred. Dr. Haydock had gone as well, presumably to make arrangements for a proper post-mortem examination. The constables had removed the body more than half an hour ago. Life, as it always did, was moving on. But Miss Marple had not moved on. Her mind was occupied with bitter almonds and blackened silver, and the peculiar way Mrs. Bully had wiped down her stall with such particular care. These are truly exceptional apples, Lady Bantry was saying, selecting specimens for her bushel with an expert eye. You must be very proud of them, Mrs. Bully. Thank you, Lady Bantry. Mrs. Bully's voice was steady, but her face remained pale. My husband would have been pleased to see this harvest. Jack Bolly had returned and now stood behind the stall, helping his mother pack the apples in straw. He worked in silence, his jaw tight, his movements jerky with suppressed emotion. Every so often his gaze would drift to the place where Cole had died, and something hard would flicker across his features. Miss Marple watched him thoughtfully. Young men with tempers and debts were always worth watching, particularly when the deceased had been a moneylender. She made a mental note to discover exactly how much Jack Bully might have owed Aubrey Cole. Mrs. Bully had picked up the apple tester and was wiping it with a cloth, her movements brisk and efficient. Too efficient, perhaps, too anxious to remove every trace of use. What a clever instrument, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I don't believe I've ever seen one quite like it. Mrs. Bully glanced up, startled. It's just a standard tester, ma'am. Most good greengrocers have them. May I? Miss Marple held out her hand with a gentle smile. For just a moment, Mrs. Bully hesitated. Then, aware that refusal would seem churlish, she passed the tester across the table. Mind the point. It's quite sharp. Miss Marple took the tool carefully, turning it in her hands as though admiring its construction. It was perhaps 6 inches long, made of steel, with a tubular barrel and a plunger mechanism for ejecting the core, the sort of thing one might see in any fruit market. Unremarkable and practical, except that it was not unremarkable at all. The outside of the barrel gleamed, polished to a high shine by Mrs. Bully's energetic wiping. But when Miss Marple tilted the instrument to catch the light and peered into the hollow tube, she saw something that made her catch her breath. Inside the barrel, right where it curved at the cutting edge, there was a tiny discoloration. Not rust exactly, though it had that reddish tinge, more like a crust of something that had been hastily wiped but not entirely removed. It clung to a minuscule vent hole, no larger than a pinprick, that allowed air to escape when the tester was driven into fruit. Miss Marple brought the tester closer to her face, examining the spot with the focused attention she might have given to a particularly difficult piece of needlework. The granular texture of the crust, the faint smear line leading away from it, as though something had been applied, and then wiped in haste, and beneath it all, if one looked very carefully indeed, the barest ghost of that bitter almond. Scent, Miss Marple? Lady Bantry sounded concerned. What are you looking at? Just admiring the craftsmanship, Miss Marple said mildly. She pressed the plunger mechanism experimentally. It moved, but not with the smooth ease one would expect from a tool that had been used 100 times that morning. There was a stiffness to it, a slight resistance, as though something had gummed up the works and then been incompletely cleaned away. "You've been very busy this morning." "Mrs. Bully," Miss Marple observed, still examining the tester. "I imagine you must have given out dozens of tastings." "A fair number," Mrs. Bully agreed. Her voice had gone cautious. "The tester worked perfectly throughout, no sticking or jamming. None at all." But Mrs. Bully's eyes had narrowed slightly, and her son had stopped packing apples to stare at Miss Marple with an expression that mingled confusion and weariness. Miss Marple smiled, her gentle, vague smile. "How fortunate. Tools can be so unreliable, can't they? My nephew Raymond once bought me a very expensive pair of secateurs, and they jammed on the very first rose stem." She handed the tester back to Mrs. Bully, who took it with hands that were not entirely steady. "Thank you for indulging an old woman's curiosity. It really is a most ingenious device." Mrs. Bully wiped the tester again, though it hardly needed wiping, and set it down on the block with more force than was strictly necessary. "Will there be anything else, Lady Bantry?" "Just a bushel, thank you." Lady Bantry paid for her apples, and she and Miss Marple moved away from the stall with the basket between them. They had gone perhaps 20 paces when Lady Bantry said in a low voice, "Jane, you saw something in that tester." "What was it?" "A rust bloom," Miss Marple replied quietly. "Inside the barrel, right at the vent hole. Very small, very subtle, but most definitely there." "Rust, on a tool that supposedly had been in constant use all morning?" "Precisely. And it was not simple rust, Dolly. It had a peculiar granular quality, and there was a smear line, as though something had been applied with great care to that specific spot and then wiped away in haste." Lady Bantry's eyes widened. "You think someone tampered with the tester?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we have been very careful today. That is what Mrs. Bully said earlier, if you recall. We have been careful today." An odd turn of phrase, don't you think? As though there was some reason today required more care than other days. They had reached the edge of the square now. Miss Marple paused and looked back at the apple stall. Mrs. Bully was serving another customer, her movements efficient but mechanical. Jack stood with his arms folded, staring at nothing. The magnificent display of King Pippins glowed in the afternoon sun. The plunger was stiff as well, Miss Marple continued thoughtfully. Not the action of a tool that had been used repeatedly, more like something that had been specially prepared and then employed only once for Cole's tasting. For Cole's tasting. Lady Bantry shivered despite the warmth of the day. "But Jane, if someone doctored the tester, they must have done it right there at the stall, in full view of everyone. How could they possibly manage such a thing without being seen?" "That," Miss Marple said, "is precisely what we must discover. But I suspect, dear, that the answer lies in misdirection. People see what they expect to see, a bustling market, a busy stallholder, the ordinary business of a Saturday morning. Who would notice one small, careful action amid all that activity?" She adjusted her gloves with precise movements. "I think it is time we had a conversation with Mr. Pratt, the chemist. A man in his profession would know a great deal about substances that leave rust-colored stains and smell of bitter almond. You think he's involved?" "I think," Miss Marple said gently, "that he may be able to tell us who purchased certain items recently. Items that have no business being anywhere near an apple stall. And with that," she set off across the square toward the chemist's shop, her step as brisk as her mind, leaving Lady Bantry to hurry after her with the basket of apples and a growing sense that her quiet friend from St. Mary Mead was about to uncover something very dark indeed. Chapter 5. Vinegar Under the Block. Mr. Pratt's establishment occupied a corner of the square. Its bow window displayed an assortment of items that would have bewildered anyone not familiar with the country practice of combining trades. Bottles of patent medicine stood beside tins of rat poison. Boxes of lemon salts kept company with carpenter's nails. A jar of boiled sweets shared shelf space with a selection of mouse traps. The sign above the door read, "Chemist and Ironmonger," though there had been no ironmonger for 20 years. And Mr. Pratt himself was now approaching 70. The bell jangled as Miss Marple and Lady Bantry entered. The interior smelled of camphor and turpentine and something medicinal that caught at the back of the throat. Mr. Pratt emerged from behind a curtain at the rear, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a small man with ginger hair going gray and the permanently stained fingers of someone who handled chemicals daily. "Ladies," he said with a bob of his head. "Terrible business about Mr. Cole. Terrible. Never seen anything like it in all my years." "Most distressing," Miss Marple agreed. "I wonder if I might trouble you for some bicarbonate of soda? I'm planning to bake a cake for the church social, and I find myself quite out." Of course, of course." Mr. Pratt bustled about behind his counter, producing a small packet. "We're out of the fancy kind. But this'll do, I expect." "Perfectly. Thank you." As he wrapped the packet, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to wander across the shelves behind him. Bottles and jars in orderly rows, brown glass containers with printed labels, a locked cabinet that doubtless held the more dangerous substances. Everything neat, everything in its place. "You must keep a fascinating inventory, Mr. Pratt," she said conversationally. "I imagine people come to you for the most unusual things." Mr. Pratt warmed to the topic immediately. "Oh my, yes. Why, just yesterday I had someone in asking for pure oil of bitter almond. Pure, mind you. Not the extract you'd use for baking, but the real thing. Had to fetch it special from the back. Don't get called for it often." Miss Marple's expression remained pleasantly vague. "How interesting. Whatever would one use such a thing for?" "Photography, mostly. Some of the fancy new developers need it. Or certain types of perfume making, though that's rare here." He lowered his voice confidentially. "Between you and me, ladies, I wasn't entirely comfortable selling it. Nasty stuff, bitter almond oil. Poisonous if mishandled." "How very concerning," Miss Marple murmured. "I do hope whoever purchased it knew what they were doing." "Oh, I'm sure they did." But Mr. Pratt looked faintly troubled. "Bought rat paste as well, the kind we mix fresh, and a pint of vinegar from the barrel out back." Lady Bantry had been examining a display of throat lozenges with rather too much attention. Now she glanced up sharply. "Vinegar. Yes, indeed. Mrs. Bully is a regular customer for vinegar. Uses it by the bucket for cleaning her stall and polishing her apples. Swears by it. But this wasn't Mrs. Bully. This was—" He trailed off, suddenly aware that he might be saying too much. Miss Marple's smile was gentle and encouraging. "It's quite all right, Mr. Pratt. I'm sure whoever it was had a perfectly innocent purpose. Well, I suppose there's no harm in saying it was Mrs. Crick, the haberdasher. Needed the vinegar for setting colors in her lace, she said, and the bitter almond oil for—" Now, what did she say? Some sort of cleaning solution, I think. "Mrs. Crick," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Nice lady. Always very neat in her dealings. Pays on the nail. Never any trouble." Mr. Pratt handed over the packet of bicarbonate. "That'll be 3 pence, Miss Marple." Miss Marple paid and thanked him. As they left the shop, the bell jangling behind them, Lady Bantry gripped her friend's arm. "Jane, did you hear that? Mrs. Crick bought bitter almond oil and rat paste yesterday." "I heard, dear. But she also bought vinegar, just like Mrs. Bully uses." "What does it mean?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Her mind was working rapidly, assembling pieces of a puzzle that was beginning to take shape. bitter almond oil, rat paste, vinegar, the rust bloom in the tester, the blackened silver spoon. "I think," she said slowly, "that we should return to the apple stall. There is something I need to verify." They made their way back across the square. The market was winding down now, the afternoon shadows lengthening. Stallholders were beginning to pack up their wares. Mrs. Bully's magnificent display had been much reduced by sales, and she and Jack were loading empty crates onto a handcart. Miss Marple approached with her most apologetic smile. "Mrs. Bully, I'm so sorry to trouble you again, but I believe I may have dropped a coin near your stall earlier. Would you mind terribly if I had a quick look?" Mrs. Bully's expression suggested she minded very much indeed, but good manners prevented her from saying so. "Go ahead, ma'am, though I've swept twice already today." "I'm sure it's my own carelessness," Miss Marple said, and bent down to peer beneath the trestle table. The space under the stall was shadowy and cluttered with empty crates and loose straw. But Miss Marple's eyes, sharp despite their watery appearance, spotted something tucked against one of the table legs. A piece of cloth folded into a compact square and pushed well back out of casual view. She reached for it, her joints protesting, and drew it out into the light. It was a rag, stained and damp. The moment she unfolded it, the sharp smell of vinegar rose up, so strong it made her eyes water. But underneath that acrid reek was something else, something bitter and chemical and wrong. "Is this yours, Mrs. Bully?" Miss Marple asked, holding up the rag. Mrs. Bully turned, and her face went very still. Yes, I must have dropped it earlier. I use vinegar for cleaning, you see. Keeps everything fresh." "Of course." Miss Marple examined the rag more closely. It was an ordinary piece of muslin, much washed and reused. But the staining on it was not ordinary at all. There were darker patches where something had been absorbed, something that the vinegar could not entirely mask, and when she held it at a certain angle, she could see a faint residue that had dried to a granular crust, very like the crust she had seen inside the apple tester. Miss Marple folded the rag carefully and held it out to Mrs. Bully. "You must be very careful with your cleaning materials, my dear. One never knows what might react badly with what." Mrs. Bully took the rag with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you, ma'am. I'll be more careful where I put things." As Miss Marple straightened up, her gaze fell on Mrs. Bully's apron. It was a clean white apron, freshly tied that morning, no doubt. But near the hem, almost invisible unless one looked very carefully, was a faint dusting of white powder, the sort of powder that might come from handling certain chemical substances. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the knife that lay on the chopping block. It should have been sticky with apple juice after a morning's work, sticky with the natural sugars and acids that came from cutting fruit. But it was clean, suspiciously clean, as though it had not been used at all that morning, or as though it had been most carefully washed. "Come along, Dolly," Miss Marple said quietly. "I think we've troubled Mrs. Bully quite enough for one day." They walked away toward the edge of the square. Behind them, Miss Marple could feel Mrs. Bully's eyes following their progress. When they were safely out of earshot, Lady Bantry turned to her friend with wide eyes. "That rag smelled of more than just vinegar." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "It did. And Mrs. Bully looked absolutely terrified when you pulled it out." "She did indeed." "But Jane, if Mrs. Crick bought the poison and Mrs. Bully had the vinegar rag, then which of them—" Miss Marple's expression was thoughtful. "That, my dear Dolly, is precisely what we must determine. But I begin to think that what we are looking at is not quite as simple as one person acting alone." She glanced back at the apple stall, where Mrs. Bully stood very still, the vinegar rag clutched in her hand. Not simple at all. Chapter 6. Alibi by Scales, Bell, and Basket. Miss Marple had always found that the best way to understand a crime was to understand the movements of people in the minutes surrounding it. Time, in her experience, was the great betrayer. People could lie about their motives, disguise their feelings, and conceal their relationships, but time was inflexible. One could not be in two places at once, and the church clock did not lie. She had convinced Lady Bantry to accompany her to the tea shop on the High Street, ostensibly for refreshment, but actually for reflection. Over cups of strong tea and slices of seed cake, Miss Marple drew out her notebook and began to reconstruct the fatal quarter hour. "Let us start with what we know," she said, her pencil poised. The church clock struck 12. At that precise moment, Mrs. Bully prepared the tasting slice and gave it to Mr. Cole. He collapsed within seconds. "Yes, I remember that clearly," Lady Bantry said. The 12th stroke had barely faded. "Quite so. Now the question is, when was the tester tampered with? It must have been shortly before noon, because the poison would have dried or been noticed otherwise. Yet Mrs. Bully was serving customers steadily all morning. When could anyone have approached the stall without being seen?" Lady Bantry frowned. There was that moment when she stepped away. I noticed it because I was waiting to speak with her about the bushel. She left the stall just before the clock struck, said something about fetching water. "Fetching water?" Miss Marple repeated, making a note. "Did you see where she went?" "Toward the back of the square, I think, where Mr. Pratt has his barrels." Miss Marple's pencil moved rapidly. So Mrs. Bully was away from her stall in the critical minutes before noon. Most interesting. At that moment, the door of the tea shop opened, and Mrs. Crick entered. She looked haggard, her neat face drawn with strain. When she spotted Miss Marple and Lady Bantry, she hesitated, as though considering retreat. But it was too late. They had seen her. "Mrs. Crick," Miss Marple called out gently, "won't you join us? You look as though you could use a cup of tea." Mrs. Crick approached reluctantly and took the offered chair. Her hands, Miss Marple noticed, were trembling slightly. Those careful hands that worked with lace and thread all day, hands that would be capable of very delicate work indeed. "Terrible thing about Mr. Cole," Mrs. Crick said in a low voice. "Simply terrible. You were at your barrow all morning, I believe?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone conversational. "Yes, I had my rent note pinned to the frame, waiting for Mr. Cole to collect." Mrs. Crick's voice turned bitter. "He always made such a show of collecting, made sure everyone knew who owed him money." "And did he collect from you?" "He never had the chance, did he? He went straight to Mrs. Bully's stall instead. I suppose he wanted his apple tasting first." She wrapped her hands around the teacup as though seeking warmth. "I saw it all happen, saw him eat that slice and fall. It was horrible." "You had a clear view from your barrow?" "Clear enough. I was perhaps 20 feet away, near the lace merchant's stall. Had been there since the market opened at 9. Miss Marple made another note. "And you didn't leave your station at all? Not even briefly?" Mrs. Crick's eyes flickered. "Well, I may have stepped away for a moment to fetch ribbon from my cart, but only for a moment, and that was well before noon." "What time, approximately?" "Perhaps 5 minutes before the hour, no more than that." Lady Bantry leaned forward. "We've been trying to piece together exactly what happened. You see, Mrs. Bully left her stall briefly as well, just before noon. Did you notice that?" "I did, actually." "She went to Mr. Pratt's barrels for vinegar, I assume." "She's always polishing those apples." Mrs. Crick's tone suggested she found such fastidiousness excessive. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "And Jack Bully, where was he during this time?" "Jack?" Mrs. Crick considered. "He was moving crates about. I remember seeing him carry one toward Reuben's waystand. That would have been around 10 minutes to noon. Then he was at the bell tower with some of the market lads. I think I heard them calling out when the clock struck. How curious, Miss Marple murmured. Everyone seems to have been moving about in those final minutes. Most unusual for such a busy market morning. Mrs. Crick looked at her sharply. What are you suggesting? Nothing at all, my dear. I'm simply trying to understand what happened. An old woman's curiosity, you might say. After Mrs. Crick had departed, looking no less troubled than when she arrived, Miss Marple turned to Lady Bantry with a thoughtful expression. We need to speak with Reuben Farley, the porter. He was at the waystand during the critical period. He may have seen more than he realizes. They found Reuben sitting on an upturned crate near the now empty scales, smoking a pipe and watching the market pack up for the day. He was a large, slow-moving man with the patient expression of someone accustomed to waiting. When Miss Marple approached, he stood politely and removed his cap. Afternoon, ladies. Good afternoon. Mr. Farley, I wonder if you might help us with a small puzzle. You were at the scales all morning, I believe? Never left my post except for a quick visit to the necessary, and that was well before 11. Did you notice Jack Bawley bringing a crate to be weighed? Reuben nodded slowly. Young Jack came by with a crate of King Pippins. Wanted to show the weight, he said. Make sure his mother wasn't being cheated on the delivery. That would have been at 7 minutes before noon, near enough. And did he stay long? Just long enough to see the weight registered. Then he took the crate back. Reuben paused, his brow furrowing. Though now you mention it, that were odd. What was odd? The crate that went back weren't the same crate that came. I noticed on account of the stenciling, the one Jack brought had Bully Orchard painted clear on the side. The one that went back had different marking, older-like. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Could you see where the second crate came from? Can't say for certain, but I reckon it were already at the stall. Under the table, perhaps. Easy enough to swap one for another if you're quick about it. And while Jack was at your scales, could you see Mrs. Bully's stall? Oh, I got a clear sight line from here. I saw Mrs. Bully step away to fetch her vinegar. Saw Mrs. Crick dart off toward her cart. Saw the whole square. Really, that's my job. Watching weights and measures. Did you see anyone approach Mrs. Bully's stall while she was away? Reuben sucked on his pipe thoughtfully. Can't say I did, but then I was watching young Jack weigh his crate. Man can't look everywhere at once. After they left Reuben, Miss Marple was silent for several moments, her mind working rapidly. Dolly, she said at last, I believe I begin to see how it was done, the timing, the movements, the crate that was swapped. It all suggests a rather clever piece of misdirection. But who, Jane? Mrs. Bully? Mrs. Crick? Young Jack? Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile. That, my dear, is what we must determine. But I think another conversation is in order, this time with someone who has no apparent involvement in the matter. Someone who might have observed without realizing what they were observing. Who? Miss Agnes Reed at the post office. Mr. Cole visited her shortly before his death, and I should very much like to know what he said. They set off toward the post office as the autumn evening gathered around them, and Miss Marple's mind continued to assemble the puzzle, pieces with the patient precision of a lifetime's practice. The chapter. 2 tokens for 1 pint. The post office occupied a small brick building at the corner of Market Street. Its window displayed notices about postal rates and warnings about foot and mouth disease. Miss Agnes Reed had run the establishment for 30 years, and in that time she had become a repository of village knowledge, second only to the vicar's wife. Nothing passed through her hands without being noted, catalogued, and filed away in her formidable memory. She was sorting the afternoon mail when Miss Marple and Lady Bantry entered, her steel-rimmed spectacles perched on her long nose, her movements precise and economical. She looked up with the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit. Miss Marple, Lady Bantry. I wondered when you might call, Good afternoon, Miss Reed. I hope we're not disturbing you. Not at all. Saturday afternoon is always quiet once the market crowd disperses. She set down her bundle of letters and regarded them with shrewd eyes. I assume you'll hear about Mr. Cole. You're very perceptive, Miss Reed sniffed. I'm a postmistress. Perception is part of the profession. What would you like to know? Miss Marple appreciated directness. It saved so much time. I understand Mr. Cole visited you shortly before his death, at approximately 11:45. 12 minutes to 12, to be exact. He came to purchase postal tokens for the dairy booth, 2 red tokens, which represent 1 pint each of milk or cream. Miss Reed consulted a ledger on her counter. He paid with a half-crown and received 4 pence change. Did he say anything about why he was purchasing tokens for the dairy? He made some remark about settling accounts, said Mrs. Bully was square now, and he wanted to show there were no hard feelings. Miss Reed's tone suggested she found this claim dubious. He made quite a show of it, actually held up the tokens and laughed about how he was the soul of generosity. Lady Bantry frowned. But I thought Mrs. Bully owed him money for the stall fees. So did everyone else. They quarreled about it quite publicly the day before. Mrs. Bully claimed he was charging her double what he charged others. He said she was trying to cheat him. It was most unpleasant. Miss Reed adjusted her spectacles. So when he came in this morning saying she was paid up, I was rather surprised. Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. Did he seem nervous? Excited? He seemed pleased with himself, which was his usual state. But yes, there was something extra in his manner, a sort of theatrical quality, as though he were playing a part for an audience. Miss Reed paused. There was one other thing. When he was counting out his change, I noticed his fingers had a white dusting on them, rather like flour, though not quite. It was on his fingertips and thumb, as though he'd been handling something powdery. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured. After they left the post office, Lady Bantry turned to her friend with bewilderment. I don't understand any of this. Why would Cole buy dairy tokens for Mrs. Bully if she owed him money? And what was that white powder on his fingers? I think, Miss Marple said slowly, that we should visit the dairy booth. There are questions that need answering. The dairy booth was operated by a cheerful girl of perhaps 19, who seemed entirely unaffected by the morning's tragedy. She greeted them with a bright smile and offered samples of her butter and cheese with the enthusiasm of youth. We're inquiring about some tokens that Mr. Cole purchased this morning for Mrs. Bully's account. Oh yes, the red tokens. Mr. Cole brought them by at about 10 to 12 and said to credit them to Mrs. Bully. Said she'd paid him what she owed. And this was his way of showing there were no hard feelings. And did you credit them? Of course, 2 pints worth. It brought her account square. The girl consulted a small ledger. She'd been running a bit behind, you see. Nothing serious, but she owed for 4 pints from the past 2 weeks. The tokens covered half of it. Lady Bantry blinked. But surely 2 tokens would only cover 2 pints, not 4. That's right. But Mr. Cole said the other 2 pints were forgiven. Wiped clean, he said. Very generous of him, she lowered her voice. My mum says he was making a show because he wanted something from Mrs. Bully. That's how men like him operate, Miss Marple thanked. The girl and drew Lady Bantry away from the booth. They walked in silence for a moment. Miss Marple's brow was furrowed in concentration. It doesn't make sense, Lady Bantry said. Why would Cole forgive Mrs. Bully's debts and make such a public show of it? Unless, Miss Marple said quietly, he wanted to make Mrs. Bully appear to have no motive for his death. If everyone knew she was no longer in debt to him, no one would suspect her. But that would mean Cole was involved in his own murder, which is absurd. Is it? Miss Marple's voice was thoughtful. Or does it mean that someone convinced Cole to participate in what he thought was a harmless piece of theater, not realizing it was laying the groundwork for murder? They had reached the square again. The market had largely disbanded now. Only a few stragglers remained, packing their goods. Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught sight of Mrs. Crick at her lace barrow, folding her wares with mechanical precision. Her face was pale and her hands shook slightly as she worked. "There's one more thing we need to check. Cole's pocketbook. Inspector Slack will have it, but I believe I can persuade him to let me have a look." They found Slack at the police station, filling out reports with the weary air of a man who wished Saturday would hurry up and end. He looked up with obvious reluctance when they entered. "Miss Marple, I suppose you've come to tell me this was murder?" "Nothing so dramatic, Inspector. I merely wondered if you might have found anything unusual in Mr. Cole's personal effects." Slack grunted. "Just the usual. Wallet with 3 dimes, pocket watch, that silver spoon you found, and his pocketbook with various issues." "I see the pocketbook." Slack hesitated, then shrugged and retrieved it from a drawer. "I don't see what harm it can do. Natural death, after all." Heart gave out. Miss Marple opened the pocketbook carefully. Inside were several folded papers which she examined one by one. Bills of sale, promissory notes. And there, near the back, a small piece of paper in a neat feminine hand. An IOU from Hilda Crick for 210 shillings, dated that very morning. But across the IOU, in Cole's own bold scrawl, was a single word: "Cancelled." And beneath that, in smaller letters, "Paid in full." Miss Marple stared at the paper for a long moment. Then she looked up at Lady Bantry with an expression of dawning understanding. "Dolly," she said very quietly, "I believe I know what happened, or rather, I know how it was meant to appear." "What do you mean?" "Someone staged a very elaborate piece of misdirection. They made it seem as though Mrs. Bawley had every reason to be grateful to Cole, and Mrs. Crick had every reason to be grateful as well. 2 women with debts, suddenly and mysteriously forgiven on the very morning Cole died." "But why?" "Because, my dear, the real killer wanted everyone looking in the wrong direction, and they very nearly succeeded." As they left the station, Miss Marple's mind was racing ahead, assembling the final pieces of a puzzle that was far more complex than anyone had suspected. Chapter 8. The Crate That Was. Swapped. Evening was settling over Market, basing when Miss Marple insisted on returning to the square one final time. Lady Bantry, who had been hoping for a quiet supper at the Golden Cock, followed with the resigned air of someone who knew protest would be useless. When Miss Marple had that particular look in her eye, mountains might be moved more easily than her determination. The square was nearly empty now. Most of the stall-holders had departed, leaving only scattered debris and the lingering smell of vegetables and animals. A boy was sweeping the cobblestones with a broom twice his height. In the gathering dusk, the church tower loomed dark against the lavender sky. Mrs. Bawley's stall stood abandoned, the trestle table folded, the empty crates stacked in untidy piles waiting for collection. Miss Marple approached them with the focused intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. "What exactly are we looking for?" Lady Bantry asked, watching as Miss Marple began examining the crates one by one. Reuben said the crate Jack brought to the scales was different from the one that returned. "I want to know which crate is which, and more importantly, what that swap was meant to accomplish." The crates were weathered wood, battered by use, and marked with various stencils and stamps. Most bore the words "Blee Orchard" in faded black paint. But one crate, slightly smaller than the others and with a different construction, had no marking at all, save for an old merchant stamp that read, "Covent Garden, 1952. Miss Marple ran her fingers along the edge of this crate. "This one is older, different wood entirely, oak rather than pine. Does that matter?" "Everything matters, dear." Miss Marple tilted the crate to examine its underside. There, driven into one corner, was a nail that gleamed bright silver in the failing light. Unlike the other nails, which were rusted and ancient, this one was new, fresh. She worked the nail loose with her fingertips. It came away easily, revealing a small hole, and caught in the wood grain beside it, a tiny scrap of blue paper. Miss Marple extracted this carefully and held it up to the light. The paper was thin, almost translucent, and roughly triangular. It had a waxy texture, and along one torn edge was a greasy stain that had darkened to brown. When Miss Marple held it to her nose, that now familiar bitter trace caught at her nostrils. "Good heavens," Lady Bantry breathed. "Is that from one of Mrs. Bully's paper cones?" "I believe so. The same blue paper, the same size." Miss Marple examined the fragment more closely. "And this grease mark is most interesting. It has that same chemical quality as the residue on the vinegar rag." She stood very still for a moment, her mind reconstructing the scene. Jack Bully, carrying the crate to the scales at 7 minutes before noon, the crate positioned just so, blocking the view of the stall from certain angles, someone crouching behind it, hidden by the bulk of the wood and the bustle of the market. Quick, careful hands working beneath the edge of the stall while everyone's attention was elsewhere. "The crate was a screen," Miss Marple said softly. "A blind, if you will. While Jack was at the scales showing off the weight, someone used the crate to conceal themselves as they tampered with the tester." "But who?" "Mrs. Crick." Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was examining the space between where the crate had stood and where the apple stall had been. It was no more than 3 feet. A person crouching low could easily have reached under the trestle table, worked with the tester, and retreated without being seen by anyone looking at the market in general. But they would have needed a few things: the paper cone to handle the poison without touching it directly, the vinegar rag to wipe away evidence afterward, and most critically, they would have needed to know exactly when Mrs. Billy would be away from her stall. "Dolly," Miss Marple said suddenly, "when Mrs. Billy went to fetch her vinegar, did anyone suggest she do so, or did she decide on her own?" Lady Bantry thought back. "I'm not certain. There was such confusion with the crowd gathering for the noon tasting. But now that you mention it, I do recall Mrs. Crick saying something about how the apples needed a final polish. Before Mr. Cole arrived, something about wanting everything perfect for the Reeve. Mrs. Crick suggested it." "Yes, I believe she did. Is that significant?" Miss Marple's expression was grave. "Very significant indeed, because it means Mrs. Crick ensured that Mrs. Bly would be away from the stall at precisely the right moment, the moment when the tampering had to be done." She turned her attention back to the crate, examining it from every angle. Beneath one of the slats, almost invisible in the shadows, she spotted something else: a thread, a single strand of lace, caught on a splinter of wood. Miss Marple teased it free with great care. It was fine work, the kind of thread used in expensive lace, the kind that Mrs. Crick sold from her barrow every Saturday. "We need to speak with Reuben again," Miss Marple said firmly. "I need to know exactly what he saw, and more importantly, what he didn't see." They found the porter at his lodgings above the stable, eating a supper of bread and cheese by candlelight. He seemed surprised but not unwilling to answer more questions. "You said you watched young Jack weigh the crate?" Miss Marple began. "Did you notice anything else happening near the stall during that time?" Reuben scratched his head thoughtfully. "Well, there was a bit of movement, natural enough with the market so busy. Mrs. Bully went off for her vinegar. Some folk were gathering, waiting for the noon tasting. Did anyone approach the stall while Mrs. Bully was gone?" "Not that I recall, though I suppose someone might have slipped behind the crate. I was focused on the scales, you understand, making sure young Jack didn't try to tip them somehow." "And after Jack left with the crate, did you see where the crate went?" "Back toward the stall, I assume, though Reuben paused, his brow furrowing. Now you mention it, I did see Mrs. Crick over that way for a moment. Thought she was helping Mrs. Bully arrange things, being neighborly-like. But she ducked down behind the stall, which struck me as odd. When was this? 2 minutes before noon, perhaps, right after Mrs. Bully came back with her vinegar. I remember because I checked my pocket watch, thinking I might go fetch my own dinner soon. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The picture was becoming clearer. Mrs. Crick suggesting that Mrs. Bully polish the apples. Mrs. Bully leaving the stall. Jack's crate providing cover. And in those critical moments, someone with careful hands and murderous intent preparing the apple tester with its deadly cargo. Thank you, Reuben. You've been most helpful. As they walked back through the darkening streets, Lady Bantry said quietly, It was Mrs. Crick, wasn't it? She bought the poison. She had the lace thread on the crate. She was seen near the stall at the critical moment. All evidence certainly points in that direction, Miss Marple agreed. But there are still pieces missing, the motive for one thing, and the curious business of Cole forgiving those debts. That doesn't fit with a simple case of a woman murdering her creditor. What do you mean? Miss Marple's face was troubled in the gaslight. I mean, my dear, that I suspect we're looking at something rather more complicated than it first appears. Cole's death was meant to look like Mrs. Bully's doing, but the evidence against Mrs. Crick is almost too convenient, as though someone wanted us to find it. A double bluff, perhaps, or perhaps something more subtle. Still, Miss Marple paused at the corner of the square, looking back at where the market had been. I think it's time we examine that paper cone more carefully. I have a small experiment in mind, and with that mysterious pronouncement, she set off toward the chemist's shop, leaving Lady Bantry to hurry after her into the gathering night. Chapter 9. A paper cone with a ring. Mr. Pratt was just closing his shop when Miss Marple and Lady Bantry arrived, slightly breathless from their hurried walk. He looked surprised to see them at such an hour, but his natural courtesy overcame any inclination to turn them away. Ladies, this is unexpected. Is something wrong? Nothing wrong, Mr. Pratt, but I wonder if I might impose upon your expertise for a small experiment. It's rather important. Something in Miss Marple's tone must have convinced him, for he ushered them inside and relit the lamps he had just extinguished. The shop sprang back into shadowy life, bottles gleaming on their shelves like captured moonlight. What sort of experiment? Miss Marple produced the scrap of blue paper she'd found at the crate. I need to test this for a certain substance. Would you happen to have a clean saucer, a small amount of bicarbonate of soda, and a dropper? Mr. Pratt's eyebrows rose, but he gathered the requested items without question. He set them on his counter and watched with obvious curiosity as Miss Marple arranged them with meticulous care. She placed the paper scrap in the center of the saucer. Then, with Mr. Pratt's dropper, she extracted a single drop of liquid from the greasy stain on the paper. This she allowed to fall onto a tiny mound of bicarbonate powder that she had sprinkled beside it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the powder began to fizz. It was a small reaction, barely visible in the lamplight, but unmistakable. The bubbling continued for several seconds, and as it did, a faint but distinctive smell rose into the air. Bitter almond. Mr. Pratt went very pale. Good Lord, is that— I rather think it is, Miss Marple said quietly. She looked up at the chemist with grave eyes. Mr. Pratt, when Mrs. Crick purchased that bitter almond oil yesterday, did she buy anything else that might be relevant? Anything at all? Mr. Pratt swallowed hard. She bought the rat paste, as I mentioned, the kind we mix fresh with a petroleum jelly base, and the vinegar, of course. He paused, thinking. And she asked about bicarbonate of soda, now that I recall. Wanted to know if it would neutralize certain types of acids. And what did you tell her? That it would, depending on the acid. But I thought it an odd question for someone buying lace cleaning supplies. He looked at the fizzing powder with dawning horror. Miss Marple, are you saying that paper cone was used to hold poison? I'm saying that someone handled a very dangerous substance with considerable care. The grease on this paper is consistent with a petroleum-based paste, and the chemical reaction we've just witnessed suggests that the paste in question contains cyanide salts derived from bitter almond oil. Lady Bantry had gone quite white. But Jane, that means whoever prepared this knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't some hasty crime of passion. This was calculated, planned. Very much so. Miss Marple carefully disposed of the evidence, washing the saucer clean with water from Mr. Pratt's sink. Someone studied how to create a poison that would act swiftly and leave minimal trace. They knew about chemical reactions, about masking smells with vinegar, about the properties of various substances. She turned back to Mr. Pratt. Would Mrs. Crick have such knowledge? The chemist hesitated. She's not an educated woman in the formal sense, but she's clever with her hands and quick to learn. I've seen her work out complicated patterns for her lace without any written instructions. She understands proportions and measurements, enough to mix a fatal poison, if someone explained the principles to her, perhaps, or if she read about it. Mr. Pratt rubbed his face wearily. There are books, you know, old formulary books that detail all sorts of preparations. I keep mine locked away, but they can be found in libraries if one knows where to look. Miss Marple thanked him, and they departed into the night. The streets were quiet now, most sensible people having retired indoors for their suppers. Gas lamps cast pools of yellow light at intervals along the pavement. We need to find that paper cone, Miss Marple said as they walked, the complete one that was used to hold the poisoned sliver. Mrs. Blee would have disposed of it quickly, but such things are never truly gone. They leave traces. Where would we even begin to look in the sweepings, dear? Markets are cleaned every Saturday evening. If we can find whoever does the sweeping, we might find our cone. They located the sweeper boy at the church steps, finishing his work by lantern light. He was perhaps 14, with the gangling awkwardness of that age, but his broom moved with practiced efficiency. "Excuse me, young man," Miss Marple called out gently. "I wonder if you might help us with a small matter." The boy straightened, wary but polite. "Ma'am, when you swept near Mrs. Blee's stall this evening, did you happen to notice any paper cones? The small blue ones she uses for apple tastings?" The boy scratched his head. "Might have done. I swept up a fair bit of rubbish from that spot. Paper, straw, apple cores, all manner of things." "And where did you put the sweepings?" "In the bin around the back of the church, where we always put them." "Gets collected Monday morning." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Would you mind terribly showing us?" The bin proved to be a large wooden affair, already half full of the day's detritus. The smell was not pleasant, and Lady Bantry made a small noise of distress. But Miss Marple, with the single-minded determination that characterized her investigations, borrowed the boy's lantern and began to sift through the contents with a stick. "Jane, this is absurd. You can't possibly find one small paper cone in all this mess. On the contrary. Dear, paper cones are distinctive and there won't be many of them. Mrs. Bully would have kept them tidily and reused them throughout the day." Miss Marple's stick paused. I believe I found something." She extracted a crumpled piece of blue paper from the refuse. It was stained and dirty, but the conical shape was still evident, and around the narrow end, where the paper would have touched the barrel of the apple tester, was a dark, greasy ring. Miss Marple held the cone up to the lantern light, examining it with fierce concentration. The ring had precisely the same width as the tester's barrel, and when she held it at just the right angle, She could see traces of that same granular residue, the petroleum-based paste that had carried its deadly cargo. "This is it," she said softly. "This is the cone that held Aubrey Cole's death." Lady Bantry stared at it with fascinated horror. "What do we do now?" Miss Marple carefully wrapped the cone in her handkerchief. "Now, my dear, we confront the killer. We have all the pieces, the method, the means, the opportunity. What remains is to understand the motive fully, and to hear the truth from the person responsible." "Mrs. Crick?" "Yes," Miss Marple said slowly. "Mrs. Crick, though I confess, Dolly, there are still aspects of this case that trouble me. The forgiven debts, for instance, and Cole's willing participation in what must have seemed to him a harmless bit of theater. These things suggest a complexity I haven't fully unraveled." She looked back toward the square, now dark and empty, where a man had died that morning amid apples and autumn sunshine. "Tomorrow," she said firmly, "we shall gather everyone involved and reveal the truth. Inspector Slack will attend, as will Dr. Haydock, and then we shall see what Mrs. Crick has to say for herself." The lantern light caught her face, revealing an expression of profound sadness mixed with iron determination. Justice, that expression said, would be served. Chapter 10. Market Basing, Tester Paste, and the Woman Who Set the Taste. Sunday afternoon brought them all together in the assembly room behind the church hall. Inspector Slack had been reluctant at first, but Miss Marple's quiet insistence, combined with Dr. Haydock's growing unease about the post-mortem findings, had convinced him that a gathering was warranted. The preliminary examination had revealed traces of cyanide in Cole's system, sufficient to make murder not just possible, but certain. They assembled at 3 o'clock, that dead hour of Sunday when the world seemed suspended, between morning service and evening tea. Mrs. Nell Blee sat with her son, Jack, both wearing their church clothes and expressions of weary defensiveness. Mrs. Hilda Crick occupied a chair near the window, her hands folded precisely in her lap, her face composed but pale. Reuben Farley stood near the door, cap in hand. Mr. Pratt had been invited as a witness to certain transactions. Lady Bantry sat beside Miss Marple, and Agnes. Reed from the post office had been asked to bring her ledger. Inspector Slack positioned himself at the front of the room with the air of a man determined to maintain control. Dr. Haydock leaned against the wall, his medical bag beside him, his expression grave. Miss Marple waited until everyone had settled before she began. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but carried clearly to every corner of the room. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is distressing, but it's necessary. Yesterday morning, Aubrey Cole was murdered in Market Basing Square, murdered with considerable skill and forethought, using a method that was both simple and ingenious." Mrs. Bully made a small sound of protest. Jack's jaw tightened. Mrs. Crick remained absolutely still. "The weapon was an apple tester," Miss Marple continued. "The poison was a paste made from crushed rat poison mixed with bitter almond oil and petroleum jelly. A minute quantity was placed inside the tester's barrel at the vent hole, so that when the first plug of apple was extracted, the poison transferred to its moist surface. Mr. Cole ate that slice and died within seconds." She paused, letting this sink in. The vinegar rag was prepared to wipe away evidence immediately, and to mask the telltale bitter almond scent. The paper cone with its greasy ring shows exactly how the poisoned paste was handled without direct contact. And the blackened silver spoon proves that cyanide was indeed present at the scene. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Yes, Miss Marple. We've established all this. The question is, who did it? Mrs. Crick purchased the poison ingredients from Mr. Pratt. She was seen near the stall at the critical time. She had motive. Cole was bleeding her dry with his lending practices. All quite true, Miss Marple agreed. And yet there are problems with this theory. She turned to Mrs. Crick, her expression kind. You did purchase those items, didn't you, my dear? Mrs. Crick's voice was barely audible. Yes. And did you intend to use them to poison Mr. Cole? A long silence. Then Mrs. Crick raised her head, and her eyes were full of tears. No, I swear on my soul I did not. Then why did you buy them? 'Cause someone asked me to. Someone who said they were for removing stains from delicate fabrics. I work with lace, you see. Fine work that needs special care. I thought... Her voice broke. I thought they were just cleaning supplies. Who asked you to buy them? Mrs. Crick's hands twisted in her lap. I can't say. I gave my word. Miss Marple's tone remained gentle but firm. Mrs. Crick, a man is dead. Your word to a murderer means nothing before the law. The silence stretched taut. Then Mrs. Crick whispered, Mrs. Blawley. It was Nell Bully who asked me. All eyes turned to the apple seller. Mrs. Bully had gone rigid in her chair, her capable hands clenched into fists. That's a lie. Jack burst out. My mother never... Jack, be silent. Mrs. Blawley's voice cut through his protest like a knife. She looked at Miss Marple with something like relief in her eyes. It's over, isn't it? You've worked it all out. I believe so, Miss Marple said quietly. Would you like to tell us yourself, or shall I? Mrs. Bully drew a long breath. You tell it. I'll correct you if you're wrong. Miss Marple nodded. Very well. Aubrey Cole had been extorting money from you for years. The stall fees he charged were double what anyone else paid. He held debts over your head and used them to humiliate you publicly. But worse than that, he had recently made a different sort of proposition, one that no decent woman could accept. Mrs. Bully's face flushed dark red. He said he'd forgive everything if I became his mistress. He said it with that sly smile, as though it were a business arrangement like any other. And you refused? Of course I refused. I may be poor, but I'm not that desperate. Her voice hardened. So I decided to kill him. Jack made a choking sound. Mrs. Crick pressed her handkerchief to her mouth. Inspector Slack leaned forward intently. You studied the problem carefully, Miss Marple continued. You went to the library and researched poisons. You realized that cyanide acts swiftly and that bitter almond oil could be obtained from a chemist, but you couldn't purchase it yourself. That would be too obvious. So you enlisted Mrs. Crick, telling her the substances were for cleaning. You knew her desperation would make her compliant. She owed rent, Mrs. Bully said flatly. I offered to help with it if she'd do me the small favor. She never knew what it was really for. Then you prepared your plan. You convinced Cole to forgive debts publicly, yours and Mrs. Crick's, making it seem as though neither of you had motive. You did this by suggesting it would make him look magnanimous, a respected figure rather than a hated one. Cole, who was vain, agreed to play his part. He thought it was brilliant, Mrs. Bully said bitterly. Thought it would make people respect him instead of fear him. The fool never realized he was signing his own death warrant. You prepared the tester early that morning, probably at home, mixed the paste, applied it carefully to the vent hole. You used your son's crate swap as cover, though Jack knew nothing about it. When you stepped away to fetch vinegar, that was genuine. You'd already done the tampering. All that remained was to offer Cole the first taste. Mrs. Bully's shoulders sagged. It worked perfectly, too perfectly. I thought I'd feel satisfaction. Instead, I just feel tired. Dr. Haydock stirred. Mrs. Bully, did you understand what you were doing? The suffering cyanide causes? I understood. I didn't care. He'd caused me suffering enough. She looked at her son, and her face crumpled. I'm sorry, Jack. I never meant for you to be caught up in this. Jack was staring at his mother as though he'd never seen her before. You killed him. You actually killed him? Yes. Mrs. Bully's voice was steady now, almost calm. And I'd do it again if I had the choice. Aubrey Cole was vermin, and the world is better without him. Inspector Slack stood. Nell Blee, I'm arresting you for the murder of Aubrey Cole. As the constables led her away, Mrs. Blee paused beside Miss Marple. How did you know? Really know? I mean, I was so careful. Miss Marple's voice was sad. You were too careful, my dear. The clean knife, when it should have been sticky. The special attention to wiping the tester. And most tellingly, you said, we have been careful today. Not I have been, but we, as though you were reminding yourself to maintain a performance. Mrs. Blee nodded slowly. Clever old woman, not clever, simply observant. And very sorry it came to this. After they had gone, Lady Bantry turned to her friend. That poor woman, driven to murder by Cole's wickedness. Yes, Miss Marple said quietly. But murder nonetheless. The law makes no exceptions for understandable motives, and rightly so. Once we start excusing murder, where does it end? They walked out into the autumn afternoon. The square was peaceful, the market long since packed away. In a few days, it would all begin again. The stalls, the bunting, the cheerful commerce of ordinary life. But Aubrey Cole would not be there to collect his fees, and Nell Bally would face justice for ensuring he never would again. Let's go home, Jane, Lady Bantry said softly. Miss Marple took her friend's arm. Yes, dear, let's go home.